Hello and welcome to our event on Grassroots COVID action, emerging stronger through engaged communities. I'm Izabela Chmielewska, hosting this webinar from Washington, D.C., though hailing from Warsaw, Poland. I am the program manager of OpenGov Hub, which is a dynamic meeting place in D.C. that brings together 50 organizations, mostly NGOs, that work worldwide to help open up governments and empower citizens. This panel is actually composed of 4 of our members: Accountability Lab, Partnership for Transparency Fund, IMAGO Global Grassroots, and Global Integrity. This event is actually the second in our COVID-19 response series, which is aligned with our 2020 programmatic goals and themes: citizen action against corruption and adapting to locally led development. We have gathered here today to learn more about the response to COVID-19 at the local level, mainly in Africa and South Asia, and what international NGOs are doing to support community action. Before we begin, let me take a moment to thank you for being here today, as our other grassroots movements in the US and across the world push for anti-racism and transformative systemic change. You'll meet our panelists momentarily, but first, here are some housekeeping pointers. So please use the chat box on the left to say hello and to comment, but use the Q&A box on the right to ask your questions after the panel discussion. We'll also do a fun activity at the end. And I will launch our first poll in a minute to get to know you, our audience, just a little better. And now, without further ado, let me introduce you to our moderator, Smriti Lakhey, the Director of Operations and Programs at Global Integrity. Smriti, please take it from here.
Thanks, Isabel. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to be here and connect with the panelist colleagues from all over to discuss, what we are seeing in how grassroots organizations are emerging and how they're emerging to support their local communities during times of COVID crisis, and what we as international community can be doing better or differently to support them to do their work in more effective and impactful manner. So I am based in Washington, D.C. For those of you who don't know Global Integrity, we are a nonprofit organization that focuses on governance and anti-corruption issues, including when it comes to delivery of services to citizens. And service delivery has been challenging, in times of COVID crisis. In Washington, D.C., we have entered into the fourth month of living with COVID, and COVID has challenged us with like our most basic assumptions of what it is to be normal. What's our normal things to do? How do we interact with our communities? And really, what's our relevance in this COVID world? And at the same time, there have been new opportunities in this chaos. And I think we are even more aware now than ever before about the importance of grassroots organizations in being able to diagnose, the issues that the communities are facing and their ability to respond rapidly and accurately to the needs of local communities. And while many of us, I think in our community, have been advocating for locally led development, I think this COVID crisis has shown us that there may be no other way than to respond to crisis and local needs through local organizations and grassroots organizations. As the so-called experts of international development are unable to fly anymore. Anyways, I'm very, very much looking forward to digging into the conversation with our panelists. And I would love at this point for the panelists to introduce yourselves. Maybe start with Johanan.
Yes, absolutely. Hi, my name is Johanan Rivera. I work at IMAGO Global Grassroots. And at IMAGO, we basically identify grassroots organizations that are doing innovative they have innovative approaches towards either providing a social service or just providing services to the community at large. And then we help them basically get finance ready so that they can scale. So we create this, like, it's basically a capacity building for grassroots organizations.
Right. Sheena, do you want to go next?
Dreaded mute button. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm Sheena Adams. I'm the Communications Director of Accountability Lab. And we're a global nonprofit that makes governance work for people in a number of ways. We do this through public-facing campaigns like Integrity Icon that tries to shift behavior, particularly around corruption, and gets young people invested in the public service. We also have an accountability incubator that nurtures social entrepreneurs through ideas around transparency and social accountability. And then the last project is called Civic Action Teams, which is a feedback model that we developed and perfected through kind of natural disasters like an earthquake in Nepal a few years ago, and also the Ebola crisis in Liberia, that really feeds validated information to communities at a grassroots level, and also ensures that their responses are fed back up to power holders. And this is a project that we recently pivoted in response to the coronavirus pandemic in a way where we are delivering bulletins each week that are trying to debunk rumors and misinformation. So in a nutshell, yeah, making good governance work for people.
Great. Sarah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Little, and I'm the Programs and Communications Manager at the Partnership for Transparency, or PTF. PTF is a relatively small nonprofit organization based in the hub, but also with offices in Zambia, Germany, India, and the Philippines. Our mission is to advance citizen-led approaches to improve governance, increase transparency, promote the rule of law, and reduce corruption in developing countries. And the way we do that is by engaging a network of experts to work with local CSOs to help acquire funding, knowledge, skills, abilities, and tools to implement innovative citizen engagement and social accountability programs.
Great, thank you. So in terms of the structure of the discussion today, we'll spend the first 30 minutes listening to the panelists, to a couple of questions that I have, and then we'll use the remaining 20 minutes to get questions from the audience. So like Isabella said, please, write down your questions in the question and answer box. And if you see any questions that's very relevant to you and you'd like to see answered, then give thumbs up, and that'll be a cue for me not to miss those questions. To get us started, I'd like to ask the panelists, how has your organization or your grassroots partners responded to the COVID-19 crisis to meet the needs of the communities, or that of the civil society organizations that are in the forefront that you are supporting? Would you like to start, Sheena?
Sure, yeah. So in many of our countries, I guess the cues that we picked up was that the initial response to the pandemic was uncoordinated and in many ways insufficient. And we realized that communities really needed to be supported to ensure that they can push back against some of these challenges and against insufficient healthcare models, for example, and also prevent what could very well have become or can still become an economic and governance crisis. And so we built on this project called Civic Action Teams, which basically deployed a network of community frontline associates in the aftermath of the earthquake in Nepal a few years ago, in a bid to sort of gather misinformation and concerns from community members, answer those concerns, and then feedback validated information to those communities, again, to try and create security in communities that were really obviously shaken up and disrupted by this earthquake. And when many of our countries went into lockdown in February, well, more around March, I guess, we realized an opportunity there to use these community frontline associates to gather rumors about the actual pandemic. And so we've been creating bulletins called the Coronavirus CivActs Campaign, which answers some of these really damaging rumors and myths from communities on a regular basis, and then tries to feed this back through bulletins that we do via email, and then also working with community radio and other kind of media organizations to really ensure we're reaching a wide variety of people. This has helped sort of, besides sort of ensure that validated information is reaching communities, we're also tackling really damaging myths and making sure that that process is inclusionary by ensuring that the information that we're feeding back to people are not, is not imposed in any way, and really comes from the household level in terms of, you know, filling gaps around, you know, how do I access government services if our country is in lockdown? Is it true that young people in Southern Africa have a sort of inbuilt immunity? And so the variety of information and leads that we've been able to get has been really revealing in helping guide this work. And so we're putting out these bulletins in Southeast Asia, in Africa, Southern Africa, West Africa for now, and hope to expand also to Latin America if possible. So yeah, that's what we've been doing.
Oh, that's really interesting. And Johanan, the way that IMAGO is supporting the grassroots organizations is a little bit different. You're coming at it from a different angle. Can you share, you know, what you're seeing?
Yes, absolutely. So like we usually are all about helping the organization scale up. But I think like in the past few months, we have really sort of like shift gears towards just like looking more at like the systems they have in place that we have, like usually help an organization have the scaffolding in order to scale, to really translate that into how can they be more resilient and bounce back quicker. So a lot of our programming, if you will, has changed dramatically in terms of like what are like the new needs these organizations have in order to be able to withstand the pandemic. But just like going back to your question on how like some of these organizations and our partners have responded to COVID like on the ground, I think so like the first thing that is very much aligned with what Sheena was saying is, I think just spreading awareness has been like like I think one of the things that has been most important early on. Especially like all of the organizations we work with in South Asia, but mostly in India, really like the first response was sort of like trying to use digital tools to disseminate messages from the government, from the World Health Organization, from UNICEF, and not only disseminate it but also translate it, and like then basically using all of, like whatever social network that is most used. I think mostly WhatsApp for the most part, and then just try to just spread information about like health, about early detection, treatment, prevention, etc. So like, I mean, basically they sound, I mean, all of these organizations completely shifted the way they serve the community, and like every single person that was part of the organization, for example, was like sending about 10 to 100 messages per day, just to make sure that people were receiving correct information in their local language as well. But like anyway, ever since, I mean, I think it has progressed a lot. I mean, we can discuss more in depth, but I'll give some time for others to reply.
Yeah, it's great. It's really interesting to see how people have picked up so quickly on technology. Mm-hmm. You know, it's almost like come naturally. What are you seeing, Sarah, in terms of like your work? You're doing more in terms of monitoring of like funds. How are your partners and you're working at the grassroots level?
Yeah, so when COVID hit, we had a couple of ongoing activities that fed right into our response. So first, PTF has, since its establishment 20 years ago, been in the business of supporting citizen monitoring of both public procurement and service delivery. So we were able to utilize the experience, capacity, some training materials, et cetera, from past and ongoing programs and alter those to fit the crisis context. And secondly, we were also right in the middle of a campaign to push for greater social accountability in World Bank supported projects more generally. And suddenly, they found themselves pushing through these huge emergency response programs. And in so doing, they publicly, in fact, recognized that the swift injection of funds carries with it significant corruption risk, principally because they're bypassing normal procedures to prevent it. So the argument that citizen-based approaches could help mitigate corruption in these types of programs has so far carried a lot more weight than I think it would have otherwise. So we're now in this kind of rolling process of designing, testing, and scaling projects. And so far, we have model projects that we've initiated to track and monitor the government response in targeted regions of India, Ghana, the Gambia, Uganda, and Zambia. We expect to expand these, maybe other countries alongside World Bank and other multilateral organization programs to try to uphold the integrity of these funds, designed to address the pandemic. In terms of individual projects themselves, we've had two fairly different streams of focus. One in India, where we have two projects focusing on making sure vulnerable migrant workers are not excluded in relief programs. And the other in various African countries, Uganda, Zambia, Ghana, and the Gambia, I mentioned, which focus more on monitoring the pandemic response itself. And that includes procurement monitoring, supply chain tracking, and citizen feedback and grievance redress. We started in Uganda, again, because at the time that COVID struck, we had an ongoing health monitoring program. So it was just a natural extension to take those relationships, our understanding of the context, staff capacity, et cetera, and build a framework for COVID monitoring around those resources that we already had. And the general idea behind what we're doing there is to generate a data-driven snapshot, so to speak, of the government's COVID-19 response as reported by beneficiaries. So more specifically, this is being done by, again, systematically recording information on funding commitments, disbursements, and procurements to flag any inconsistencies for investigation by the appropriate government authority. They're monitoring the distribution of medical supplies, such as personal protective equipment, and this is being done via health worker reporting on deliveries by SMS, and that will be compared with national purchase data. We're also soliciting both health worker and citizen feedback on public health services related to COVID-19 through social media, via SMS or anonymous phone call. And then lastly, they're holding virtual meetings with local and national government officials and international aid agencies as well to address the issues identified. This is just a small pilot project. And as I mentioned, we've got others in other countries that are, they've developed similar approaches, although each adjusted to the local context. So in Zambia, for example, in the absence of a similar mechanism, they're focused on developing ICT-enabled monitoring systems to take stock of donations. In Gambia, we're working with the Anti-Corruption Coalition Gambia, specifically targeting a government quarantine area, and then having community monitors monitor the renovation and procurement of supplies there. And lastly, in Ghana, there's a much larger focus on training, including virtual training to do more technical monitoring of budgets and procurements. So yeah, in brief, that's what we're doing so far.
Yeah, that's interesting. So there's a lot going on. Can I ask a follow-up question? Like, since it seems like, you guys have changed a little bit in terms of how you work at the grassroots level, what are, some of the pivoting moments that you have seen for yourself and for your partners? And what are some of the challenges that they have encountered as they have tried to be, more responsive or pivot to new approach?
I'm assuming you'd like me to start with that.
Yes.
Okay, sure.
Close, yes.
Yeah, well, I would just preface my answer by saying that, of course, each case is highly context specific and it's difficult to draw conclusions so early on. But one thing for sure is, of course, due to the very necessary speed at which things are happening, it's been difficult to develop frameworks and plan activities, develop our tools and training materials within a matter of weeks, which I think highlights the importance of preparedness moving forward. And of course, we have and can anticipate traditional challenges like lack of access to timely or complete information released by the government, particularly with regards to procurement, and also the lack of capacity for government to respond to citizen feedback in all cases and address grievances. So for example, for our program in Uganda, most of the feedback from health workers we've received so far is around the lack of PPE. And this is a major concern, of course, but the lack of equipment is not really due to corruption per se, but just the lack of ability of those equipments on the market in general. So if there's no capacity to respond to the grievances, then there's a major risk of citizen fatigue in reporting or sending feedback with seemingly no concrete result. And relatedly, something that was asked of PTF by nearly every partner, if not every partner, was to allow for the purchase of some basic PPE, particularly for the medical workers that they'd be engaging with. And this was done as a means to gain buy-in and start generating that positive feedback loop from the outset. So again, if over and over nurses are reporting a lack of PPE and it still doesn't come, then there's this risk of fatigue. So I think having the flexibility to respond to some of those immediate needs as well, in addition to our more mission-driven work, was important. And certainly we've had to adjust our kind of traditional models of community engagement due to movement restrictions or restrictions on the size of meetings, et cetera. And because of this challenge, we're relying both on more digital means of communication, so primarily radio, phone, SMS, social media. And then we're both disseminating and gathering information a lot more through health workers themselves, versus in the past we may have used community monitors. But again, they have, in a lot of cases, movement restrictions. So that's forced us to work more through the government staff. And lastly, I think it's just important to emphasize moving forward that these kind of monitoring programs focus on issues beyond health in the immediate response and ensure accountability and public service delivery more generally. Again, in using Uganda as an example, there's already been a procurement-related scandal around inflated food prices, which caused a loss of over $500,000. So early feedback, and then also early feedback from citizens under that same program is that the food aid that has been received, if it has been received, it's often been rotten, stale, or otherwise inedible. So clearly this is an area of concern. And again, in our programs in India, which I've not focused on as much, they're actually aimed at addressing the issue of inclusion in food aid distribution for vulnerable migrants. So clearly an important area of focus moving forward.
Yeah. Sheena, would you have anything to add?
In terms of the pivot?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. I think one of the big things we've really struggled with, while the process for the work and that feedback model was quite established, and our teams were well versed in how to adapt that. The move from face-to-face in community work to virtual only work with our teams in lockdown has been a major challenge. Especially because, generally we're quite an empathetic communicator with our team. We're very inclusive with our participants. And so we've had the benefit of that trust relationship, but I think moving everything sort of online has been a challenge to keep up with consistency. And in terms of expectation, whether it's for our participants in gathering the information or it's from the public in terms of generating that really bottom-up leads around what the myths and misinformation is that we need to be debunking, and making sure that we, I guess, are meeting people halfway in an era where mental wellness has been a challenge, and people are dealing with all kinds of sort of personal stresses that have taken them out of their comfort zone. And being really aware of being, I guess, sensitive to all those kinds of new realities. And then the one other thing, I guess, is just making sure our teams are supported enough to do this kind of fact-checking, debunking work. In a lot of ways, everyone had to jump in, particularly with our smaller teams. And so delivering those kinds of skills virtually has also been something that we paying a lot of attention to.
Okay, yep. It's interesting. Johanan, you had mentioned earlier that you're helping grassroots organizations to also bounce back from from the COVID crisis. And so what are some of these challenges that they're facing that you're helping them to navigate so that they can bounce back after this is all over?
Absolutely. Yes, just going back a little bit to the pivoting. Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to I think one of the things that we realized really early on is that one of the positive externalities of like the way we interact with the organizations we work with. It's just providing a space for organizations to do some self-reflection. And it was interesting because like in the first conversations we had, like the first two, 3 weeks with organizations that we work with, like we noticed that what they needed the most really, really early on is just to have a space where they could make sense of what was happening and where they could like manage stress, like facilitated by someone that was not part of the organization. And it was not like, so it was interesting because like really, really early on, like I think our first pivot was just like organizing this series of sessions with organizations, just like to discuss what was happening and for people to basically vent out, which like sounds super simple, but was very, very important in their process of like actually just like getting their bearings and like then having the mental space to go into like solution mode. So I just wanted to mention that because like it is interesting that it is not something that we usually do, or like maybe it happens as a byproduct of our interactions with organizations, but it was like incredibly important just to like provide a space for them to make sense of what was happening, especially because at the beginning, like things were changing so fast, information was coming in like at an incredible speed. So like, and they didn't have anyone guiding that conversation within the organization. So like there was like a lot of turmoil within organizations. But going back to your question, I think one of the things like after that first phase, I think one of the things in which we have really jumped in is just like trying to help them doing two things. One is just like look again at their minimum viable product with new eyes, right? Just like looking at the service, like at the basic service they provide with new eyes, and just like to make sure that they are looking at all of the possible ways in which they can continue to provide the service within the new normal. And second is like really helping them with value chain analysis. I think one of the main challenges for a lot of these organizations has been, of course, like these like broken linkages in the value chain as product of what is happening in the world. And like, so I think just helping them realize how could they, for example, source local spices for, you know, for like some of like enterprises from Sewa that like, you know, provide like healthy snacks for children. Like just like how can they maybe have a better sense of like what is the local landscape in terms of value change, and like change some of those providers, so like which is like one of like very specific thing that I think a lot of these organizations are having issues with, and like that like are on top of like everything that we've discussed in like beyond like digital infrastructure or digital literacy, which I think is like a very sort of like universal challenge that these organizations are facing. I think the other thing is just like really helping them source things from more local sources, which is not an easy task.
Great, that's very interesting. That, you know, getting people to come together to reflect becomes such an important part of how you respond to the crisis. We have a couple of like poll results that have come in that I wanted to just flag. We have, you know, our audience comes from all over this morning, mostly from Latin America and Caribbean, and some from South Asia and Africa as well. So it's great. And then the second poll result has just come in, like, which is, in your view, what's the most important action that the grassroots community has been taking during the pandemic? And you know, most of us in the audience think that it's informing the community about COVID-19 facts. Great. Well, it's great to hear what's you know, happening at the community level, what the grassroots organizations are doing. Let's turn our conversation a little bit more towards now, you know, what can we as international development community can be doing, the international NGOs or the donors, to support grassroots organizations to be more effective in their role going forward. Who would like to start? How about you, Sarah?
Sure. I mean, I think from where we're sitting, the big opportunity here is to leverage the bypassed accountability mechanisms in these development agency funding to pressure them and governments to open up the civic space, to allow and actually help contribute to an independent civil society-led monitoring of these programs. And the hope is that we can make gains now in terms of finding those new or adjusted modalities for development agencies to work with and fund CSOs in an emergency context, not only to establish systems for the next crisis, but to open the civic space and build capacity for more regular engagement in general. So that's the hope and the kind of thrust behind our work with these development agencies. And I can't, as I said, we've gained an entry point, it seems, due to the crisis. And I can't speak directly for the motivation behind that, except for that it seems, these independent citizen-led projects can be developed and funded independently and if necessary after the fact, outside the expedited processes for project approval. So again, we'll see how this goes, but early indications are good for the opportunity anyway to expand the civic space for civil society involvement in exercising accountability for the implementation of development programs that are funded by agencies like the World Bank. And as well, we're really working out the mechanisms, again, by which IFIs can directly or indirectly fund this kind of activity. It's not a traditional role, so it's a new avenue, and we're working through them now.
That's really exciting. Sounds very promising. Sheena.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things is that, in many ways, COVID has been this great equalizer that's meant that from a healthcare and developmental perspective, we've all pretty much been affected dramatically, whether we're from a developing country or a developed country. And so it's made us reflect a lot on decision-making spaces generally. With that great equalizer, for example, there've been lots of stories around the Ebola crisis in Africa and what lessons some of those underdeveloped or developing countries rather can give to the rest of the world, having come from this history of dealing with a pandemic that's highly infectious and really devastating. And so we've been thinking about, maybe we can use some of these lessons to ensure that decision-making spaces are representative or a lot more representative, even if that means as IOs, giving up our seats to other organizations, as an example, to make sure that power is really distributed or co-created better. And part of this, I guess, is also maybe building the capacity of local consultants, to earlier points around, the ban on travel, finding experts in country who organizations can work with to develop, grounded solutions to some of these challenges instead of parachuting in knowledge or other kind of experts. And so really localizing, I guess, that development narrative in an authentic way are some of the things.
One of the things that I was saying, just like better understand the impact of the informal economy, like on the informal economy, especially because I think most of the main, like most packages that like either governments, the private sector, and also just like international development are putting together, it's very hard for them to reach the informal sector. So one of the things that we're doing is just like trying to just like better assess what are the potential effects on the formal sector. And just like to put an example, one of the organizations that we work with the most is SEWA in India, and it's a women-owned organization. It's basically a cooperative, basically owned by 2 million women, out of which 1.9 million women work in the informal sector. So what I mean is like 1.9 million women out of like that 2 million women organization do not have access to any cash transfers. Like on top of like everything that is happening with the global pandemic, they also don't have any access to any type of relief by the government, or even by programs put together by the World Bank that are distributed by the government. So I think like one of the things is just like how can we be more effective at reaching the informal sector? It's one of like the main challenges that we've we found. The other part is like especially for small grassroots organizations, we believe that like this type of shock, of external shock, really has long-lasting effects within the organization. And like, I mean, like the fact that like these organizations really work at the base of the pyramid and are dealing with an incredible amount of stressors, like it really affects like the way they are making decisions, and like the way they're making decisions are going to affect their like future outlook as well. So like just like understanding the long-term effects, like the long-term effects of like these like type of organizational trauma, if you want to call it somehow, I think it's also really, really important, and it's also something we're looking into as well.
Okay, thank you. And sorry for the technical difficulties of our Zoom crashing. We have Smriti back here, so she'll take it from here. And then once Sarah is back, she'll join us again. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, technology is great when it works, and when it crashes, not so great. Great. So at this point, I would like to take some questions. I would have loved to take some questions from our audience. But while Isabella figures out how to retrieve some of the questions, that came in, I have one that I made note of that I'd like to pose to you guys, and it comes from Richard Funkhauser at Freedom House, and he wanted to know what have been some of your personal learnings from your experience of working with the grassroots organization, like in the COVID context.
I can jump in quickly on one aspect, which was around the beautiful benefits of experimentation. It's something that we've tried to sort of inculcate into our work culture since we've been founded. And it's, it depends very much on your personality, I guess, and your approach to it as to how that lands for you. But in many ways with COVID, where we feel that we're in this eye of the storm that doesn't want to end, and the dynamism requirements are just off the charts. It's been really awesome having that to rely on, the freedom to fail and get up the next day and maybe try a different approach has been really liberating, and has also helped to respond, has allowed us rather to respond quite creatively to challenges that appear very differently in different parts of the world. And so that's one place, I guess, where yeah, that freedom to fail has worked out really well.
Yeah, and just to connect to that, like, I think that has really, really generated a lot of innovation at the grassroots. Like, it's incredible how this type of organization, they're really like nimble and they really adapt fast. And like the reason why they do it, and the reason why they are so good at it, is because they have so much, like such a deep knowledge of their community and the community they work with. And I think what they have noticed is that like a lot of these organizations basically have really being able to really quickly react to the most important needs of the community they are in. And like you can see this, like, I mean, we've seen this particularly with organizations that that are basically mostly led by women, like they have shifted so quickly. They are now producing masks, they are producing hand sanitizer, they are all doing all sorts of like they're providing services that they were not, I mean, are not part of like their original the original menu of things they provide, but they have shifted super quickly. They've been super innovative. They were super ingenious. So I think that, I mean, it goes with freedom to fail. It has also really sort of like ignited a lot of innovation from grassroots organizations in particular. And like also like, I mean, just how much they have used technology, and how much there's been, I think, also like a link between, like an intergenerational link, right? Like a lot of the organizations we work with are like, the members are not particularly digitally literate, but like you can see like their sons or their grandsons, jumping in and helping them figure out a Zoom call, or jumping in. So like it has really created a bridge, a generational bridge that has allowed them to have the digital literacy they need to actually make use of some of these tools, which has been wonderful to see.
Those are really inspiring. Thanks for sharing. I'm going to move on to another question. It comes from Nada Zodi, who is the director of Open Gov Hub. And she wants to know, what do the panelists think that international policy and advocacy NGOs who are not grassroots themselves can do during the pandemic to support grassroots partners? So more on the focus of what can policy and advocacy NGOs be doing. Sarah, would you like to jump in? Welcome back.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. I'm technically inept this morning. Yeah, I mean, going back to, again, the work that we're doing with the IFIs, I think just advocating for civil society engagement as a, actionable process to hold governments accountable for the programs they support is really important. There's not, again, always the mechanisms or modalities to make, relatively small grants as compared to huge programs that they're pushing through on behalf of governments. So, I mean, that's a core of PTF's work in this effort, is to try to find those modalities so that you can fund CSO oversight, that can be a regular part of development work. So I think, yeah, that advocating for more community engagement in general for these organizations, and of course documenting and presenting best practices to show the impact that they can have for relatively small cost.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I think another thing that we can, where advocacy comes in is just really pushing for governments, particular local governments, municipal governments, and like local private organizations, just to do partnerships with grassroots organizations. What I mean is, like, I think like there's an element to be there's something to be said about enhanced coordination and how some of these grassroots organizations really have in place like the natural structure to serve as like surveillance mechanisms to monitor, track, and report program outcomes and metrics, to update multidimensional poverty indexes. So I think there is something to be said about pushing for more partnerships with grassroots organizations to really have more data on a day-to-day basis. So I think that is one of the things that that organizations could potentially push for local governments, to really identify a couple of grassroots organizations that they can partner with so that they can monitor and give information in real time.
I mean, one thing that I guess is also linked to that is subgranting consciously, especially now with sort of COVID-specific grants, considering as maybe a larger organization being the subgrantee and letting a smaller organization get a bigger bite at that pie, and maybe take a policy lead in terms of how that project is structured. That could also sort of link to kind of new innovative policies that we need in the sector.
Yep. I mean, that's really interesting. And that leads me to, we've talked about, the need to partner with grassroots organizations a lot, right? Like, and then I think the pushback in the past has been, well, it's really hard to get, like, I think the NGOs and the development community, sometimes they're like, there's the capacity gap. And I think that capacity gap is more on the reporting front and the way that, we expect our subgrantees to interact with us in certain ways through our rules of, like, you have to present data some way, or like you have to communicate in some, like, in certain structure. And, my hope is that because now it's a brave new world where, we're revisiting the rules and the norms, that, the international community and donors can shift also in the way that we work with grassroots organizations, and not really be saying that it's about, capacity constraint, because I think a lot of grassroots organizations really know their communities and can really respond. And the capacity constraint might be more in terms of how they interact with the donor community and NGOs.
Yeah, and perhaps even reframing that capacity constraint as an opportunity, especially now that we're all sort of building up our virtual capabilities. There may well be an opportunity for us to jump in and fill that gap.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we're almost at the end of our hour, and we have the poll results from the last poll, which was what's the biggest gap in civil society responses during this pandemic, and most of our audience think that it's the lack of funds and lack of power, which is something that many of you have pointed out during this conversation about like shifting the power, giving the power to local communities to monitor the funds and make decisions. Great. So I think we may have time for one last question. And as we have said this over and over again, that we're in completely uncharted territory with COVID. And while it brings many challenges, it also brings new opportunities. And because we don't really know how this is all going to play out, like Sheena and Sarah, I think you said that it's very liberating at the same time to think creatively in crazy new ways and bold ways. So my question to you is, what's your crazy prediction of how grassroots organizations and the development community will evolve in the post-COVID world? Whoever wants to go first. Sheena, your microphone is still on, so I'll call on you first.
I'm just going to go back, I think, to that point about, this being the great equalizer. And I think there's going to be a lot more respect generally for smaller players and more sort of local voices, given that, in many countries, particularly, I guess, in Africa, where I live in South Africa. And we've seen so many examples of like really small organizations bootstrapping themselves into really innovative projects or making hand sanitizer, etc. And so I think that power dynamic, or I hope that power dynamic is going to shift quite dramatically. And it feels like it's happening in a sustainable way. Some of the conversations we've been part of, organizations are in a very reflective mood. And so, yeah, it seems like now's the time to strike.
Great. Johanan, what's your crazy prediction of how it's all going to unfold?
Well, I think just as a preface, like I'm done making any predictions just because like I was supposed to get married at the beginning of COVID, and I had to postpone the wedding for 1 year, and now even 1 year after, like next March doesn't look that that realistic. So what I mean is of course, like we don't know what is going to happen. I do believe, especially for grassroots organizations, that like these shifts toward digital provision of their services is going to stay a little bit. I think like a lot of organizations who work with, particularly in the education sector, have realized the power of digital engaging children through digital means. I honestly think that's one of like the big things that is going to stay. The other thing I think is going to push particularly more commodity-driven organizations to think more local, to really sort of like diversify their distributors, and like to really think, like to rethink about their value chain. But who knows? It also will depend on like what are like the long-term effects of
I think we lost Johanan. Maybe we'll move on to Sarah and then reconnect with Johanan when he comes back.
Yes, I'll be on the lookout for him.
Okay,
Thanks.
sure. And this is really just a follow-up to the very eloquent responses of Sheena. And I think in the case of COVID, social accountability and this kind of community engagement was an attractive afterthought for the development agencies like the World Bank that we're engaging in. And I hope that it becomes more than an afterthought, that it's not something on the fringes, but yet something that is well integrated into all of our development work. So it's an opportunity, and I think it's the role of organizations like ours to take that opportunity, document what we're doing, document the impact, and position ourselves and position our CSO partners to be prepared in advance of the next crisis.
Great. Yes, those are all really bold ideas that let's get behind on, and I hope it comes true. I hope your predictions are all true. And we have Janice back.
Yes.
Do you want to finish your thoughts?
Yeah, I don't even remember my thought. I literally got kicked out, and I was just scrambling to get back in before the end of the. So just continue the conversation. I can just jump in at some point.
Yeah, great. I mean, what Sheena and Sarah were saying, that maybe this is the time that those on the fringes, like grassroots organization, really get to be at central players and have more autonomy in the decision making, and we get to take more chances.
I think a crazy prediction would be just like more funding for grassroots movements. So what I mean is, like, I think, like, honestly, grassroots organizations have been like basically play a role equivalent to first responders in many communities. And I think the importance of that type of response, particularly with external shocks, has been very, very evident. So hopefully that also translates into some more funding for these type of organizations, for collective organizations, for cooperatives, for all these type of like interesting models of grassroots organizations.
Great. I hope these predictions come true. So at this point, we have come to the end of our discussion. Thank you very much for sharing your insights. I really enjoyed learning about what you're doing, and it's given me new ideas in terms of how we may engage with our partners going forward. And thank you for all the participants who stuck with us through the technological difficulties. I see that some of you are still here, and thank you for your questions. Before we part our ways, I just want to ask the panelists if you have like one takeaway for the audience. Anything you want to highlight in terms of your messaging on working with grassroots?
I mean, I would just say raise your voice. Any opportunity you get, make it felt. Now's the time to be doing it, and I think a lot of people are accepting of it. So don't be silent. Be active. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Sheena. Well, thank you very much for your time, to all the panelists, and thank you to all our audience. And Isabel, did you want to say anything before our final goodbyes?
Yes. Again, thank you for joining. Thank you for your patience while we had to deal with Zoom difficulties. I guess everyone's on Zoom now, and it just was overloaded. But I just want to reiterate some of the key points that were said here. We like to do takeaways. So I heard raise your voice, be active, make way for locally led development, and don't underestimate the power of the community in dealing with crises, whether it's COVID or other issues. At the end, I know that not many people participated in our virtual posted activity, but please feel free to do so if you'd like to. I'll launch one more exit poll. As you make your way through the day, and just want to thank you again from the Open Gov Hub for joining us this morning to talk about grassroots COVID action. And thank you most of all to all the panelists, Smriti, Sarah, Sheena, and Johanan, for your time and your expertise and sharing this moment with us.